December 9, 1961. The heat hangs low over Dar es Salaam like a second skin. The ocean breathes slow and salty against the shore, and the streets are a river of khaki uniforms, patterned kittens, and the bright, sun-blanched faces of people who have spent years rehearsing what freedom should look like. Flags flap, not yet the red, black, and green of every imagined future, but the flutter of something new, tentative. A brass band strains to keep time under blinding light. Somewhere a radio coughs static and English voices. The air tastes of dust and diesel and the sharp tang of coconut oil. Into that crowded, electric morning steps Julius Kambarage Nyerere, not a general, not a magnate, but a man still most often called Mwalimu, the teacher. He moves in a way that carries both the restraint of the classroom and the weight of an entire people's expectation. Children cling to the hems of their mothers' dresses. Elders rock forward to see the face they have debated and defended in countless huts and union meetings. He climbs the low platform and stands before microphones that click and hum like insects. There stands a small forest of metal. There is no fanfare meant to flatter him, only the steady, patient noise of a nation beginning to measure itself. Nyerere's voice when he speaks is neither booming nor theatrical. It is the plain, disciplined voice of someone who has spent years explaining math and grammar to teenagers, the teacher's voice that makes complex ideas seem like chores anyone can learn. He does not demand loyalty, he teaches it. He will not dress the moment up with grandiose promises that glitter and fade. He speaks in terms of duties, of land and language, of schools and the small daily habits that bind families and villages together. Around him are the men who organized rallies, the women who stitched banners through the night, the British officials whose formal uniforms make the scene feel like a courtly game. But the focus is not on them, it is on the promise that this moment will be more than a caption in an old empire-esque scrapbook. Before he stood on that platform, before the crowds and the cameras, Nyerere was first a teacher, Makerere College in Kampala, then classrooms in Tabra and Butiama. A man who had traded the relative safety of a steady wage for the restless work of persuading people that they could govern themselves. He had read Catholic social thought and John Stuart Mill in the dim light of a missionary study hall. He argued on petty stages and in market squares that African people's lives should be written by their own hands. The restraint he learned in schoolrooms became his political armor. He listened, he corrected, he returned to the fundamentals. That pedagogical habit, to explain, to simplify, to insist on ethics would become a national language. The British flags are lowered. Speeches are given by men with titles that, until very recently, meant the difference between order and disruption. But when the formalities end and the microphones are quiet, is the quiet acts that matter. Nyerere stepping down from the platform and walking among ordinary people, exchanging a few words with a market vendor about pricing, asking a school teacher about class sizes, listening to a farmer describe drought. He insists on meeting ordinary citizens face-to-face because, in his private notes and public rhetoric, the nation he wants to build is not a cathedral of power, but a network of classrooms and small, accountable communities. East African community, there is a tangible tension, too. The newly sovereign state is thin-skinned. Neighboring lands are watching, foreign embassies are keeping lists, and the Cold War hums in the background like a distant engine. Nyerere feels it all, but does not let it determine the first lessons he will teach his country. Instead of grand gestures toward industrial empires or quick privatizations, he will try to anchor the new state in the familiar vocabulary of collective life. He frames independence not as an endpoint, but as the start of a long-course curriculum, literacy, communal responsibility, public service. It is a choice that will win him admiration and make him a target for both idealists and critics. On that day, with the sun pressing down and the microphones cooling in the shade, a teacher-turned-leader looks across a crowd and decides to teach a country how to be decent to one another. It is a modest ambition, dangerous for its humility. But in a continent of coups and brittle borders, there is something quietly revolutionary about building a nation by insisting on integrity, that public officials must be accountable, that the state will serve the people, and that leadership is a burden, not a reward. The Roots of a Teacher, Butiama, 1920. To the story of Tanzania's transformation begins far from the capital, in a small lakeside village called Butiama, where the air was thick with the hum of crickets and the scent of banana leaves. It was here, on April 13, 1922, that Julius Kambarage Nyerere was born, the son of a Zanaki chief, but raised among herders, farmers, and storytellers who measured wisdom not by titles but by honesty. His early days were quiet, the kind of quiet that hides great storms. His father ruled by example rather than decree. He mediated disputes under a large tree, insisting that truth cannot be hidden forever. Julius watched, absorbing every lesson about patience, fairness, and restraint. When the Catholic missionaries built a small school nearby, Julius walked miles barefoot each morning, carrying nothing but a slate and an eagerness that made teachers whisper, "That boy will go far." The school was strict, the priest severe, but he thrived in discipline. For the young Julius, education was not about escape. It was about understanding how power worked and how to wield it without corruption. By the time he reached Makerere College in Uganda, Nyerere had become something rare, a young African who could navigate both the language of the colonizer and the silence of the village. He excelled in history, logic, and ethics, but what made him unforgettable was his moral clarity. He didn't just learn ideas, he lived them. In 1949, Nyerere sailed to the University of Edinburgh, the first Tanzanian ever to study there. The cold Scottish wind bit at his fingers, but the libraries, those ancient stone cathedrals of thought, offered warmth of a different kind. There, he read Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Marx, and the Gospels side by side. What fascinated him most was not power or wealth, but how societies sustain justice without losing their soul. Scotland taught him something crucial: independence means nothing without integrity. He saw poverty in Glasgow's industrial slums, where men worked themselves to exhaustion for pennies. He saw arrogance in colonial offices, where Africa was discussed like a chessboard. And in those contrasts, he began to shape his own political philosophy, a blend of Christian ethics, African communalism, and modern socialism. When he returned home in 1952, the sun over Tanganyika felt warmer, heavier, more expectant. He became a teacher at St. Francis College, Pugu, standing before chalkboards filled with English grammar and civic duty. But the classroom was too small for the ideas burning inside him. He began gathering villagers, traders, and fellow teachers under mango trees, explaining that independence wasn't just about removing the British, it was about proving that Africans could govern with honor and fairness. He would later tell his students, "If we are not guided by morality and integrity, our independence will mean nothing." Those words echoed through fields and villages, planting seeds of what would soon become the Tanganyika African National Union (TANU). What made Nyerere's movement different was its tone: calm, deliberate, patient. While other leaders shouted through megaphones, he spoke like a teacher giving instructions before an exam, clearly, simply, without malice. His humility was disarming. Even the colonial administrators, accustomed to dealing with fiery radicals, were caught off guard by this soft-spoken man who argued for equality with logic sharper than any blade. By 1958, his reputation had spread across East Africa. He was no longer just Mwalimu Nyerere, but the conscience of a generation. His speeches were copied in notebooks, passed hand to hand, memorized in secret meetings. He talked not of vengeance, but of self-reliance, not of enemies, but of responsibility. And when the British finally realized that Tanganyika's independence was inevitable, it was Nyerere's calm moral authority, not guns or protests, that forced their respect. The teacher from Butiama was about to take on a new classroom, one with millions of students, 1,000 tribes, and the eyes of the world upon it. The blueprint for a moral nation. January 1967. The coastal wines of Dar es Salaam carried more than the scent of salt and diesel that month. They carried a question that haunted the heart of a new nation. What now? Tanganyika had merged with Zanzibar 3 years earlier, forming Tanzania, a union that brought both promise and fragility. The flag was new, the anthem young, and the people full of faith. But beneath the songs of unity were deep cracks, poverty, illiteracy, tribal divisions, and the creeping shadow of corruption that often comes when a revolution wins too soon. Nyerere saw it coming. He felt it in every meeting where young officials, once humble, began arriving in imported suits and polished cars. He saw it in the way urban elites whispered in English while the farmers, the backbone of the nation, still plowed barefoot. And so, on February 5, 1967, he gathered his ministers and advisors in the small coastal town of Arusha and presented what would become one of Africa's most daring political manifestos, the Arusha Declaration. In simple, unadorned words, it declared that Tanzania would follow a path of Ujamaa, a Swahili word meaning familiarhood. It was not Marxism, not capitalism, not imported ideology. It was a uniquely African socialism rooted in the village spirit that had raised him. Nyerere stood before the crowd that day and said, "We, the people of Tanzania, do not need to be rich individually for our nation to be rich. We need to work together, live together, and serve together." The speech electrified the nation. Factories halted as workers gathered around radios. In small towns, people argued under the shade of mango trees, trying to imagine what Ujamaa meant for them. Nyerere's plan was bold, even utopian. He envisioned villages where people would live collectively, share land and tools, and work for the common good. No one would exploit another. No leader would hoard wealth. Teachers, doctors, and farmers would all be equals, contributing according to their ability, receiving according to their need. He refused to live above those he led. He kept no palace, no fleet of cars, no private accounts abroad. When foreign dignitaries visited, they often found the president walking to his modest office or riding in a battered Land Rover. His suits were simple. His smile, quiet but firm, disarmed kings and capitalists alike. Yet, implementing Ujamaa was another story. The government began villagization, moving scattered rural populations into collective settlements to make schools, clinics, and water systems accessible. On paper, it was practical. In reality, it was chaotic. Thousands resisted being uprooted from ancestral lands. Some burned their own huts rather than be moved. Officials, in their zeal to please the president, enforced policies harshly. But Nyerere was not blind to the pain. He traveled constantly, visiting villages, sitting cross-legged with farmers, listening more than speaking. In one meeting, an old man challenged him. "Mwalimu, you say this is our way, but are we choosing or being told?" Nyerere smiled sadly and replied, "A teacher sometimes must insist that a student reads, not because he hates him, but because he loves what he can become." It was both his greatest virtue and his deepest flaw. He trusted in education, persuasion, and moral duty more than in coercion or wealth. By the early 1970s, Tanzania was poor but peaceful, a miracle in a continent bleeding from coups and civil wars. There were no ethnic massacres, no elite military takeovers, no dictator's palace looming over the skyline. In a sea of chaos, Nyerere's nation stood like a quiet, disciplined student, struggling but unbroken. Western economists mocked his policies as naive. Aid agencies sneered. But African leaders, from Ghana to Mozambique, visited him seeking advice, wondering how he maintained unity where others ruled through fear. His answer was always the same. You cannot build a nation without trust. You cannot lead without integrity. In a world drunk on power, Julius Nyerere was a sober man. And for a while, his example made Tanzania the conscience of Africa. The trials of idealism. By 1974, the idealism of Ujamaa had begun to collide with the stubborn realities of economics. Tanzania was still young, its dreams grand, its pockets empty. The first wave of collective villages had formed across the country, but food production had fallen sharply. Many farmers, uprooted from their lands, struggled to adapt to the communal system. Fields went unplanted, tools were scarce. And while Nyerere's moral vision inspired the world, it could not fill an empty stomach. The oil crisis of the 1970s struck like a hammer. Fuel prices skyrocketed, transport slowed, and factories that depended on imported machinery ground to a halt. Yet, through the hardship, Nyerere refused to abandon his principles. When foreign investors offered aid tied to private profits, he turned them away. When the International Monetary Fund pushed for austerity, he resisted, insisting that sovereignty was worth more than loans. At cabinet meetings, some ministers grew restless. They whispered that Ujamaa had failed, that Tanzania was being left behind by nations that embraced capitalism, but Nyerere remained unshaken. He told them, "You do not measure a nation's success by the number of millionaires it produces, but by the number of people who can sleep without hunger and fear." His words resonated deeply with ordinary Tanzanians, who, despite hardship, respected his honesty. Corruption was nearly absent from his government, a rare miracle in post-colonial Africa. Ministers caught abusing power were dismissed publicly. He lived by the same rules he set for others. When his salary was published in newspapers, people were shocked to find it barely above that of a senior teacher. But integrity, however noble, could not build roads or feed cities alone. By 1978, drought hit the countryside. The economy faltered, and neighboring Uganda, under the erratic rule of Idi Amin, invaded Tanzania's Kagera region. The war was not just military, it was moral. Amin had mocked Nyerere's gentleness, calling him the schoolteacher who dreams of peace, but when Tanzanian forces crossed the border in 1979, their discipline and unity crushed Amin's army within months. Kampala fell, and Amin fled. It was one of Nyerere's proudest but most painful victories. He had defended Tanzania's integrity, but at a high price. The war drained the treasury, deepened debt, and stretched the limits of a nation already struggling to feed itself. In the years that followed, he became more introspective. His speeches turned philosophical, less about policies, more about moral survival. He began to question whether his countrymen understood what he had truly tried to teach. In one address, he admitted softly, "Perhaps we tried to go too fast. Perhaps we expected angels when we are still men." Yet, even as the world called him a failed socialist, his people called him Wali Mu, still the teacher. He had not made them rich, but he had made them honest. Throughout the 1980s, global winds shifted. Capitalism triumphed, and socialism, a once seen as the moral path for the developing world, was collapsing. The IMF returned, offering loans that came with bitter conditions, privatization, cuts, and reforms that dismantled the Ujamaa structure. Nyerere could have clung to power, blamed others, or ruled by fear. But instead, in 1985, after 24 years in office, he did what few African leaders ever dared. He stepped down voluntarily. He walked out of the State House without ceremony, carrying a single suitcase. Reporters waited, expecting a grand statement, but all he said was, "I have done my part. Now, others must continue the work." He retired to his home in Butiama, living simply, tending to his farm, reading philosophy, and mentoring young leaders who visited him in search of wisdom. In the quiet of his later years, Nyerere watched as the world slowly began to understand what he had tried to build, not a utopia of wealth, but a republic of conscience.